Usually, software engineers are some of the best paid employees in the entire world. They have a great job prospects, and some of them are even able to earn seven figures. Now, of course, there are people on the other side of the spectrum as well who are freelancing and barely making ends meet. But the people who are really in a sticky situation are the ones that are in the middle. These guys generally work for extremely well-known brands like EA, Activision Blizzard, and Ubisoft, but they're often treated like Amazon warehouse workers. This is quite surprising given that software developers are white-collar workers and are essential in bringing these games to market. Not to mention, the number of games that these companies release per year has reduced substantially. So you would think that software engineers would have less on their plate, but this is not the case. In fact, software engineers at these companies often work 12 hours per day, 6 days a week. And when a game is getting close to its launch day, this ramps up to as much as 13 hours per day and 7 days per week. This isn't some sort of new discovery either. This has been common practice within the gaming industry dating as far back as 2004. In fact, EA has already settled 2 class action lawsuits regarding labor abuse. But 20 years later, nothing much has changed at EA, and this is the same case with Activision Blizzard, Ubisoft, and even Epic Games. Given how demanding these companies are, you would think that they at least pay well. That must be why people are sticking around, right? Well, that's not true either. While these companies do definitely pay a livable wage, it's nowhere close to what these software engineers could be earning if they spent their efforts elsewhere. Take Ubisoft for example. Entry-level engineers at Ubisoft earn $54,000 per year, while senior software engineers earn $87,000 per year. This sounds good until you realize that Google pays their entry-level engineers $180,000 per year and their senior engineers $326,000 per year. So here's how these game developers trap engineers and get away with working them to the bone while paying them below market wages. You commonly hear the career advice of follow your passion and that if you do something you love, you'll never work a day of your life. But this advice completely falls apart when you factor in companies that abuse their employees' passion. The gaming industry is just one example of this, but this issue is present throughout the entire job market. The companies with the best working conditions are generally those with products that people aren't exactly passionate about. I mean, I don't think anybody is particularly passionate about writing algorithms that collect other people's data. So, companies like Facebook and Google have to pay larger salaries and offer better perks to get people to jump through some moral hoops and do work that doesn't exactly excite them. On the flip side, companies like Tesla and SpaceX are able to pay far lower salaries and demand much more, because the people who work there are extremely passionate about the final product and company mission. Game companies very much fall on this side of the spectrum. The software engineers that apply to these companies are generally avid gamers themselves, and they're usually super motivated to bring games that gave them so much joy to other players. This sentiment usually gets them trapped into a vicious loop. As one game developer put it, it tends to be more fun at the beginning of a project and a lot of drudgery at the end. Just when you think you might want to switch jobs, you're given a new project and your passion for the art is reignited. And before you know it, you keep going down the same rabbit hole over and over and over again. One EA executive has even admitted that toxic environments are inevitable within large publishers. And the worst part is that the class action lawsuits that we talked about arguably just made things worse for these developers. For example, the second lawsuit against EA resulted in many employees being reclassified as hourly workers instead of salaried workers. The reasoning behind this is that hourly workers would have to be paid overtime, while salaried workers did not. This seems like a good thing until you realize that hourly workers are ineligible for stock-based compensation, which is where the money is really at. At Google, for example, well over half of principal engineers' compensation is in the form of stock, and that's not even accounting for stock growth. We all know that the FANG companies have killed it over the past 10 years, but some of these game developers have actually grown even more than FANG companies. EA, for example, has grown 10x in the past 10 years, while Activision Blizzard has grown 5x. And much of this growth is attributable to the work being done by game developers. Yet many of them won't even benefit from the company doing so well, given that they're treated as hourly workers. So, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like following their passion has actually worked out all that well. While many developers get stuck in this vicious loop for their entire careers, some do try to look for other opportunities, but it doesn't take them long to realize that they're kind of stuck. Here's the thing, while EA and Google both need software engineers, the work that engineers do at these companies couldn't be more different. At EA, software engineers are primarily going to be working to develop things like collision detection, collision response, physics, animations, and user inputs. Meanwhile, at Google, software engineers are primarily going to be working on search algorithms, sorting through data, debugging production issues, and identifying edge cases. Virtually none of this has to do with programming, great physics, or fluid game mechanics. And while most programmers agree that game development is way harder, companies don't hire employees based on how hard their previous work was. Companies hire based on how relevant and applicable the previous work was. So it's typically quite difficult for engineers that spent their entire careers in game development to switch to traditional software engineering. This issue is only made worse with time. As software engineers progress through the ranks, their jobs have less to do with coding and more to do with systems design and leveraging enterprise solutions. This includes things like Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, Oracle Apps, SAP, Salesforce, and so on. With that being said, when a game developer with 10 years experience interviews for a software engineering position, the questions are going to be less about reversing linked lists and creating binary trees and more about how familiar they are with SAP S/4HANA or AWS. The developers that are competing against the game developer are likely to have a traditional background and will thus be able to answer these questions much better. Now, you might be asking, why not just apply for a lower level position? Well, the problem is that it's even harder to get these jobs because you come off as being overqualified. In an ideal world, recruiters would take a closer look at the game developer's background and let them interview for the more junior role, so that they can learn the ropes on the tech side of things. But more times than not, companies dismiss such applicants as engineers with a lack of trajectory. If a given developer has 10 years of experience but they still aren't familiar with systems design or enterprise solutions, the applicant comes off as someone who isn't growing and learning, and no one wants to hire someone that isn't growing and learning. So while some game developers try venturing out, they're often hit with a bunch of rejection, and usually they end up staying at their current role or switching to yet another game company, and the cycle just continues. It's not all terrible news though, as there are a few game companies that prioritize employees' mental health. One of these companies is Riot Games, who is the developer behind League of Legends and Valorant. Not only does Riot Games rank favorably when it comes to workplace culture, they actually rank at the top. In fact, 95% of Riot employees say that it's a great place to work, while the average for a US company is only 57%. But even Riot falls victim to one of the biggest issues within the game development industry, which is gender-based discrimination. Just a few years ago, Riot's entire leadership was men, and they actually got sued for discrimination. They ended up settling for $100 million, and since then, Riot has diversified their leadership to include 20% women. But it doesn't seem like the sentiment has changed all that much. Yes, Riot has expanded their diversity, but it appears that this is more of a show to appease courts than a true shift in culture. A similar situation can be found at Ubisoft as well. In fact, an internal survey at Ubisoft revealed that 25% of employees had seen or experienced workplace misconduct. In addition to this, 1 in 5 said that they didn't feel fully respected or safe in the work environment. Since then, Ubisoft has gone ahead and fired a bunch of their executive team. But to be honest, there's not much that these companies can do because that's not where the issue really stems from. This issue really stems from the gaming community itself, which can oftentimes be quite toxic. This isn't just limited to gaming per se. Basically, any online community where you can mask your identity is pretty toxic. And given that the gaming community is likely the largest community in which this is possible, it's no wonder that they're also arguably the most toxic. Of course, this isn't to say that all gamers are toxic. The vast majority of gamers are perfectly normal people. but it just takes a few bad actors here and there to gain a bad reputation. And if you want an example of just how toxic online communities can get, I recommend checking out the YouTube channel Masked Arab. The YouTuber basically goes onto Omegle dressed as an Arab, and basically everyone is racist to him. It's actually pretty funny because the YouTuber generally roasts these people pretty hard, but it's also sad that people can be so toxic. When you combine this online toxicity with the fact that hardcore gaming communities are dominated by men, it's not surprising that women working at these game companies often have to deal with a bunch of discrimination and toxicity. In the end, most game companies are nostalgic to many of us as we grew up seeing their loading animations over and over again, and many of us have sunk more hours into these games than we'd like to admit. Considering this, it's not surprising that many of these people would like to enter game development themselves and bring joy to a new generation of people. But unfortunately, the industry is not all that great. First of all, given that you're driven by passion, it's easy for these mega companies to take advantage of that and demand more work while paying relatively less. And if you get far into a game development career, it's often hard to switch to a traditional software engineering role, as you often don't possess the knowledge and expertise that would be expected of someone at your level. And if you're a woman, all of these issues are just going to be amplified even more. So what's the solution to this? Well, theoretically speaking, it's actually really simple. Instead of only following passion, the key would be to follow a combination of passion and opportunity. If you're a programmer interested in game development, the answer might be to join Twitch or Discord. These companies deal with much more traditional engineering skills like integration with AWS. So you'd be able to participate in and grow the gaming community while not being subject to its various pitfalls. And if enough people start thinking like this and move away from traditional development companies, then maybe the situation may just get better. But that's just what I think. Would you want to be a game developer? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you hope that conditions at these gaming companies get better. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.